Welcome to Who's Better, Who's Worse. In our last episode, we pitted Oberyn Martell against Jaime Lannister for the title of Who's the Better Warrior. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at Ramsay Bolton, the bitter bastard, and Gregor Clegane, Tywin's mad dog. Asking which one you would rather be the victim of is a little like asking what would you prefer shoved up your backside, broken glass or razor blades. And the title they're competing for is... Who is the most vile and twisted villain? See, I told you it wouldn't always be about fighting. We'll be taking these assholes with both their show and book depiction in mind, and at the end we'll decide who is the worst one to be locked in a keep with. These right here are the categories we'll be using to dictate the winner. In regards to the word of God, you know George R. R. Martin's thoughts on the characters, there wasn't much to dive into besides George saying,
Ramsay's a misunderstood fella.
I'll bet he fucking is. Let's start with where most evil begins, and that is their psychology. Before we continue on this one, here's a quick disclaimer. Please make sure you read it before calling us out as impersonating medical professionals. Thanks, guys. Now, you don't need a psychology degree to see Ramsay and Gregor have ASPD or antisocial personality disorder in spades. But to what degree and what pop psych category? Starting with Gregor. With what little we know about him, I'd posit Gregor Clegane ticks most boxes for a cluster B clinical psychopath. A disorder including but not limited to these markers here. Granted, he is missing a couple of boxes like highly manipulative, pathological lying, faking positive emotions and charm, etc., and he does display a certain impulsivity and rageful hot-headedness more commonly connected to sociopathy. But we could very easily chalk this up more to his physicality. Trying to think straight with intense headaches makes scheming and planned manipulation a little difficult. Not to mention it would have an effect on your anger management capabilities and impulse control. Gregor is also pretty dumb, which isn't what most people think when they think psychopath. But it's actually a myth that all psychopaths are masterminds. Psychopaths actually, believe it or not, tend to score lower than average on IQ tests in general and learn to appear intelligent and charming as a way to navigate our world in a way that makes them successful and their disorder invisible. This illusion of intelligence isn't really necessary for a psychopath to thrive in Westeros, especially if their profession involves violence. So there was never a need for Gregor to give the impression of intelligence, which is why he lacks that marker. I'm no expert, must keep stressing that, but since his upbringing was also one of reasonable privilege and being the favored son, and he was displaying these callous traits from such an early age, recall Why the Hound is Scared of Fire, I'd lean more towards Gregor's innate lack of empathy, morality, and conscience being a product of his neuro makeup from birth.
There's no cure for being a cunt.
Rather than socially influenced factors.
Though the argument is still potentially there that his father covering up what he did to Sandor gave Gregor a false sense of confidence that he could get away with anything, and that was the start of sociopathic development.
When you're confronted with Gregor, what you're met with is indifference. He's not actually sadistic if you're going by the literal definition of it. He tortures people, that's for sure, but it's often out of cold mockery like was the case with Vargo Hoat, or straight up boredom and simply because he can. In reality, he just doesn't care how his actions affect others, as long as he gets what he wants, whether that be baser pleasures like is the case with you-know-what crime with his female victims, or peace and quiet through murder as was the case with one of his loudly snoring subordinates. Were it not for the anger that likely results from his headaches, Gregor would probably be a cold, unfeeling void without emotion. A true psychopath. Now, Ramsay is a little more tricky. He holds many of the same traits and in fact ticks some of the boxes that Gregor doesn't. Not to mention his father Roose displays many of the traits of a psychopath, and there are some researched arguments that psychopathy is genetic. However, the argument that Ramsay's ASPD is socially influenced and therefore sociopathic is far stronger. Look at the circumstances of his conception.
She was the miller's wife. Apparently they'd married without my knowledge or consent, so I had him hanged. And I took her beneath the tree where he was swaying.
No way he wasn't raised in a broken home. Then factor in behavioral influence of the original Reek when appointed his servant, who either encouraged immoral behavior or facilitated it, and then later his exposure to his father's cold and ruthless style of ruling. Another thing to factor in is Ramsay's extremely obvious sadism. Contrary to popular belief, psychopaths tend not to take an interest in sadism as it generally requires emotional empathy, which psychopaths tend to be almost completely devoid of. Hence why psychopaths often get their thrills through more more baseline instinctive activations of dopamine, if you catch my drift. Ramsay, however, clearly enjoys and to some degree gets off on torturing people and inflicting pain, enough to hone it into a bona fide skill of his. And while he absolutely takes it to the extremes that might, and it's a big might, get a rise out of a psychopath, he clearly relishes it on all levels from the mundane to the extremes. Ramsay also forms something resembling close personal bonds, another thing often alien to psychopaths. He looks up to and to some degree idolizes his father, only opting to kill him when his claim to Warden of the North was threatened by a more legitimate heir, and he possessed a very close bond with the original Reek, so much so that you could even argue/theorize that his twisting and warping of Theon may have been a sick and messed up, possibly even guilt-driven attempt to bring his friend back to life after being forced into a it's you or me situation. And while he certainly didn't love or care about them, he had a strong degree of personal attachment to the Bastards boys and their show counterpart Miranda, feeling a strong sense of anger when they were murdered, whereas a psychopath likely wouldn't even care in the slightest. Combine all of this with his impulsivity and lack of self-control in situations where it might better serve him to self-restrain, e.g. his hunting practices, and then factor in his deep insecurities and the clear emotional effect it has on him regarding his bastard status, and you have all the ingredients for a sociopath rather than a psychopath. That's just our assessment anyway. Where do you guys think these two sit on the ASPD spectrum? Let us know down in the comments. When it comes to who's the worst out of the two in this category, it's a tough one. Both are lumbered with an abundance of negative personality traits, and neither is even remotely justified in their actions because of it. Assuming our assessments are accurate, there is an absolute sliver of an argument that Gregor was born wired up the way he is, and is in essence blind and deaf to emotion and empathy from birth through his physical makeup, which cannot be changed. However, it in no way excuses his actions. Psychopaths are capable of immense good. Think the heart surgeon who saves your grandfather because his hands are steady due to him viewing your grandpa as machinery, or the firefighter who rushes into a burning building without hesitance to save your daughter because they don't have a typical fear response. Psychopathy doesn't excuse evil, and Gregor is a sick and evil bastard. But there is the faintest, weakest, absolute clutching at straws argument that he is at the very least indifferent to the suffering and evil he brings upon you. In other words, your suffering isn't really what he's after, it's just a byproduct of his objective.
You killed him? No, I shot him. Bullets in the fall killed him.
Ramsay, on the other hand, again assuming our assessment is accurate, is a sociopath and is likely capable of experiencing the full spectrum of emotions and is at the very least capable of feeling empathy, although likely highly suppressed. This means he full well understands the emotional distress his actions are bringing upon you, and in his mind has some twisted and fucked up way of justifying it to himself. Then factor in Ramsay's sadism. Unlike Gregor, your suffering isn't a byproduct of his desires or objective. It is itself the objective. Your pain and anguish pleases Ramsay, adding another layer of sick and twisted to his personality, and that for us tips the scales ever so slightly in his favor. Conclusion: both are the fucking worst in this category, but Ramsay is a little bit worser, and therefore, by the skin of his victim, he takes it. Now let's move on to abuse of respectable and admirable traits, and I better keep this one short after the previous tirade or Tom's gonna get his scissors out. Gregor has many traits that if put to use for different reasons would be respect-worthy. He's big, strong, a very capable warrior, and an anointed knight with his own lands. He could have been a hero in the eyes of the common folk, a living legend, the defender of the weak and champion of the realm, with his lands being some of the safest around, instead of a frightful hellhole and a keep where servants constantly go missing. Ramsay is not so blessed. He's no great warrior, nor is he a shrewd politician. He was a fairly effective Warden of the North and battle commander, but even then his power stemmed from fear and nepotism rather than earned respect or martial prowess. His talents extend to torture, and while it's clear he has some intellect, it stems from highly negative avenues such as manipulation and sly deception rather than ingenuity and inventiveness, and as such it's very hard to frame positively or put his cunning mind to use for respectable purposes like you could argue with, say, Tyrion. Don't even know why I'm dragging this out. It's very clear Gregor has some respectable and admirable traits and abuses the shit out of them, while Ramsay has none whatsoever to begin with. Gregor is clearly the worst in this category. Moving on to sympathetic/pitiable traits. A good villain has layers, and there should be some aspects of them that are humanizing or at the very least pitiable, if not sympathetic. This category is unique, as the worst is the one with the fewest of these traits. Starting with Gregor, there is very little to sympathize with in the slightest. Going by what we know he seems to have grown up with the privilege of a minor lord's eldest son and all that entails, including undisputed legitimacy, priority of inheritance, not to mention education in his role as part of the nobility. And while we can't say for certain, it's likely there was at least an attempt to instill him with lordly values. He's been knighted, landed, and is a vassal to one of the most powerful houses in Westeros. He's got free run of his lands and basically has the medieval equivalent of a playboy lifestyle, with the occasional inconvenience of having to ride to war for his liege lord. Gregor only has one sympathetic trait, and that is his headaches. He's supposedly in constant pain and requires milk of the poppy to dull it. Can't be nice, let's be honest. Justification for a short temper? Sure. Justification for indiscriminate murder, brutality, and you-know-what crime? Absolutely not. Now, Ramsay has a little bit more of a case for why he's so screwed up. He's the product of you-know-what crime, and his mother had to try and raise him single-handedly, with his unruly nature proving too much for her to deal with alone. His male role model from an early age was the morally bankrupt Reek, and then after that, his cruel, skin-flaying father. Pile onto this, he is a bastard, lacking a strong claim and a true sense of belonging to his house. Even with the legitimizing decree, he's aware he's Roos's expendable lackey and serves as discardable, plausible deniability for his father's dirty work, and before killing Roos, basically lived life with a sword over his head, knowing full well his father, whom he looked up to and sought approval from, wouldn't even hesitate to kill him if his disruption ever outweighed his usefulness. Now, you might say that Tywin uses Gregor in much the same way. However, Gregor is a landed knight with legitimate titles and a host of loyal bannermen under him. He is not nearly as casually discardable as Ramsay is. Gregor is Tywin's proudly flaunted attack dog used to instill fear, whereas Ramsay is Roos's dirty, shameful secret he could happily do without. There is a difference. Needless to say, having been brought up under these circumstances, it's fair to posit that unlike Gregor, Ramsay never had a chance of turning out halfway decent. And while you certainly can't sympathize with him, like at all, there is a small degree of pity to be afforded to him due to the circumstances of his upbringing. This one isn't even remotely close. Gregor's headaches don't so much as halfway explain his brutality and twisted evil. I suffer chronic migraines myself, they really do suck, but they don't make me want to go out pillaging and murdering. Ramsay's upbringing, on the other hand, explains a lot. A mother who couldn't cope, extremely twisted male role models, and a constant anxiety about where you fit in the world, coupled with the autonomy to act as you see fit, providing it's useful to your father's goals, but with the caveat he'll casually have you murdered at a moment's notice if you piss him off too much. Like I said, definitely not sympathetic, but a little, and I mean like single grain of sand level, pitiable. Gregor is obviously the worst in this category. And our final category before we lock you in a keep with them, despicable acts. This is a difficult category, especially with these two characters. I don't want to make this some sick R-rated article where I describe their despicable actions in vivid detail. Both have committed some of the most horrendous acts you could possibly imagine, and if you're watching this, you've seen the show or read the books, so I don't need to recreate or fetishize every single one of those scenes for you. We all know their most prolific crimes, Gregor's brutal murder and you-know-what of Elia Martell and her children, and Ramsay's twisting of Theon into Reek. I'll just give one horrific, lesser-known, book-only example for each, and I'm sure your imagination can do the rest. Gregor saw fit to deal with the sellsword Vargo Hoat by slowly cutting his limbs and extremities off one by one over a long and drawn-out period, but having the wounds treated so he would stay alive through all of it, in a cruel mockery of Hoat's own sadistic practices. That's bad enough, but Gregor takes it one step further, cooking the severed extremities and feeding them to prisoners and Hoat himself. Needless to say, extremely cruel and messed up, even though you can kind of argue Hoat deserved it. Now, Ramsay's hunting of women is depicted in the show, but trust me when I say the show depiction is rather tame in comparison to the books. Ramsay doesn't just hunt the women. At the end, he has his way with them, kills them, lets the original Reek have his way with the corpse, and flays the body before feeding what's left to the dogs. And that's only providing the girl gave him good sport. Those that make poor sport receive much the same treatment, except they are flayed alive. Purely with checkboxes, they both come out roughly the same when it comes to the worst acts of evil. Looking at their actions, both seem to be mainly driven heavily by two of the four primal motivators. In this case, lust for violence and lust in other regards. The key differentiator between their disgusting behaviors is the way they perceive their victim and the implications that it has for the poor soul. There is a simplistic, bordering on almost utilitarian approach in how Gregor views abuse his victims. They are nothing more or less than a means to an end to satisfy his itch for violence or the other thing in that moment, and are to be discarded once that itch for the deplorable has been scratched. Defiance or submission is irrelevant, as Gregor only seeks dominance over the physical, which means if you choose to, you can willingly fight him till the bitter end. It's a poor consolation prize, but when you die at the hands of Gregor, you at least die as yourself. Ramsay seeks domination in totality. Defiance is unacceptable to him, and he will ensure through tricks and traps your fighting spirit is agonizingly stripped away from you, so that in the end you'll question the very walls around you, and view even an open door as an invitation to suffering rather than freedom. Ramsay has long since discovered there is no greater dungeon to trap one's victim than that of their own mind. He shapes and warps until everything you are is gone, and the shambling wreck that remains belongs solely to him. And when death is finally granted, you die as a twisted, faded shadow of who you once were. Yeah, Gregor is fucking evil, and I'm in no way trying to diminish the immorality of his actions, but Ramsay takes this one by a country mile. The sick fuck.
Well, one reason I enjoy it.
And with that final category, we're at the conclusion. Who is the worst? Now, before we give our own thoughts, we thought we'd give you a simple thought experiment to help you make your own mind up on who you think is the worst. Imagine you're locked in a keep, and one of these is locked in with you. Which one do you hope it is? Let us know who you picked down below, guys. Now for our thoughts. Asking which one of these two is the worst is kind of like asking what would you rather have hunting you, a Terminator or Pennywise the Clown. Both are bad for their own reasons. One is a relentless, cold, unfeeling machine that's next to impossible to physically overpower, that can push through everything short of a death blow to reach you. The other is a constant lurking presence, hiding in both the shadows and the dark corners of your mind, waiting till you're at your most vulnerable to strike. But if we're honestly asking who's the worst, there really is no competition. Gregor is a fucking deplorable waste of a human, relentless and to your average Joe unstoppable. But Gregor is and always will be an exterior threat, and therefore escapable. His harm always extends from the physical, and because of this, if you know where he is, you know where you are. It's you or him. Rally, my good man, and take heart knowing you can die fighting to the end, and likely very quickly also. Or, run for your life like a smart person would. Ramsay, on the other hand, is a far more insidious presence. A persistent infection of mental instability and ever-mounting paranoia. Even without his physical presence, he takes up residence in the mind of his victims, turning their own senses and instincts against them, until what remains is something less than human, good only for sport and to satiate the hunger of hounds. The anguish Ramsay inflicts, be it physical, mental, or both, is a long, drawn-out process, with every ounce of your suffering nourishing the sick bastard, as another piece of your soul becomes his property. But the worst element of Ramsay is that, in the end, you won't even want to fight. You won't want to be free. He may not always be with you in body, but he'll always remain with you in mind and soul. Death will be your only release. A monster in the dark fades away in the presence of light, but the monster in the mind is only made brighter. Ramsay Bolton, you are the absolute worst.